Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think everybody who was reading papers or watching TV on Friday night or reading papers on Saturday or Sunday knows that a very big step was taken in our state's ongoing conversation about its fiscal posture. And that was when Governor Quinn came out with a pretty detailed statement, maybe not a bill, but a statement about what he intends to do regarding our state finances, which are not what they used to be. It was a big weekend for news, and I think that now the City Club and all of you here today are going to see that story advance, because it is our privilege once again, in what's becoming almost an annual visit, to welcome the leader of the Illinois Senate Republicans, ladies and gentlemen from Lamont and LaGrange, Illinois. Here is Chris Radogno.
This is a little bouncy. Well, thank you. It's right. The last time I was here was for the Rich Miller roast, and I can tell you, even though I'm a little nervous now, that was way worse. So I'm not good at stand-up comedy. And that certainly isn't what our state budget is about. Now, I do appreciate the invitation, and I like to come out here each year to talk about what's going on in the state. Usually my remarks are done a week or so in advance, but this year, as Chris mentioned, things are changing so quickly that I literally was finishing this at 11 o'clock, and I hope that it's still relevant by the time we walk out of here today. So the table that we have set in Springfield right now really hasn't changed from when I was here last year. It's all about the state's fiscal problems. We have massive fiscal issues. We are a deadbeat state with $8 billion in unpaid bills. That hasn't really changed. Our credit rating is the worst in the nation. We continue to spend beyond our means, and there's not even any disagreement about that. I mean, the Civic Federation estimated that if we keep going on the trajectory that we're on, we'll have a $34 billion deficit in 5 years. The Senate Republicans last year predicted that to be $22 billion in 5 years, and even the governor's own numbers talked about a potential $5 billion deficit in 3 years. So there is no disagreement that the track we're on is unsustainable. Our jobs climate continues to lag between our neighboring states and the national average. And Illinois really isn't and never was just like all the other states that were hit by the recession. It's been mismanaged for a full decade into a much deeper hole than the other states around us. I always have to point out, not coincidentally, there has been one-party control. It has not been Republican for a decade. But there is one difference that from when I spoke to you last year at this time, about a little over a year ago now. We've had a 67%, $7 billion tax increase. Again, I have to remind people, passed at 1:30 in the morning. Not a single Republican vote on that, and in fact, several lame ducks, or it probably wouldn't have passed. Now, at that time, that was touted as a solution to the structural deficit that we have in this state. Clearly, it hasn't worked. Now, that's being ominously proven false by the fact that the rating agencies are once again threatening a downgrade. And they cite two things. Despite the tax increase, we haven't gotten a hold on the pension situation and the Medicaid situation. It really isn't that difficult to understand. But what it does prove is that you have to have, if you have a structural deficit, you have to have a structural reform, not just revenue reform. We said that last year. Structural deficit, structural reform. Revenue cannot be the answer, or you end up in the same hole. Now, the threat to our bond rating, along with the election, where the Democrats know that they're going to be held accountable for their failure to govern for the last decade, are two factors that have led me to my Cubs-like optimism that maybe this is the year. There has been mounting pressure because of the potentially lowered bond ratings and the election year religion, and the election year religion, that we just might get some positive results. So those two factors are convening to create some real discussion about the problems that we have. So in the Capitol, not unlike last year, the discussion is all about the state budget. We've actually had a bipartisan bicameral agreement on how much money we expect to come into the state this year, $33.7 billion. We have not had the agreement on how to spend that money. In general, Republicans are saying spend less than 33.7, devote the rest of it to paying off bills. We still will have a spirited discussion, I think, about how to divide up what is left after we pay for pensions and Medicaid and so on. But despite that tax increase that we had, and that's $7 billion that's figured into the 33.7, we still have unsustainable spending, and we still have to address those two big problems, Medicaid and pensions. And I want to spend some time now walking through the governor's proposals and my thoughts about those. First of all, generally my response to what the governor introduced or talked about on Thursday and Friday is generally positive. I think it's a giant step forward, the very fact that there's recognition that these are in fact problems that are going to require some really difficult solutions. That's in stark contrast, frankly, to last year when I stood here talking about those very problems and the Senate Republicans put out a plan to try to address those, and the governor said, and I quote, "I'm not listening to them." So we have made progress just by virtue of the fact of recognizing the problem. I'm going to talk about pensions first. I don't think I need to go through how bad it is, the worst funded system in the nation, and how underfunded it is, the debt that amounts to $8,000 per person. Everyone recognizes it's a problem. The pension liabilities, along with Medicaid, are now beginning to crowd out all the other spending the state needs to do, things like education, transportation, public safety. So it's putting a lot of pressure on us to come up with some solutions. You know, our long-term payments, when we passed a bill in 2010 to lower the benefits of new employees, yield at a $70 billion savings over the long term. So what we've demonstrated by doing that is reform can actually work to bring about savings. Now, the next step is the tough one, and that has to do with current state employees. Not current retirees. The governor did not address current retirees, only current state workers. So in a nutshell, what the governor said is that employees will have a choice. They can keep their current retirement benefits. They will not have a 3% increase in their contribution, but they will have their pensionable salary frozen so that any increases from here on out will not count towards their pension, and will lose access to retiree health care. Now, the governor said access. Some people talk about the amount of the subsidy. The issue here is that health care is not protected by the Constitution, so we're setting up sort of a stick to encourage people to take a lower benefit plan. The thinking here is to try to address what the Senate Democrats have raised as what they view as the constitutionality of making a change to current employees. There needs to be offer and consideration, and I think the governor's plan attempted to address that. I don't have any problem with that at all. The other choice, though, that people have, so if you're a current employee, you can keep everything, but you lose health care, is that you can agree to increase your contribution by 3%. You can take a reduced pension COLA, so instead of a 3% annually compounded COLA, when you retire, you get a flat 3% or half a CPI, whichever is less. You delay your COLA implementation to age 67 or 5 years after your retirement, and the retirement age goes up to 67. So it's a pretty bold proposal. Frankly, I agree with the governor on the issues of increasing the retirement age, reducing the compounded COLA. Quite frankly, that early retirement age, that rule of 85, which allows state workers to retire after the combination of their age and service reaches 85, was only put into place in the year 2000. But we have a lot of folks who now are able to retire at around their mid-50s and continue working at other jobs and having the state pick up all of their health care insurance during that time. That is simply unsustainable, and as I walk doors and talk to people, that is something the average person feels really needs to change. It was too rich in 2000, and it needs to be corrected. Similarly, that compounded COLA has only been in effect since the 1990s. It's not something that has been around forever. Again, even when I talk to retirees, many of them feel that that's probably something that is too good to be true, and it is, and we probably need to address that, although, again, the governor did not talk about current retirees. So the average person gets those kinds of things, and I think there's a lot of support for it, and I believe I read this morning there's some polling that indicates in general people support that. Now the question, and we don't have a bill yet, and that's very important. We have concepts, we have dot points, and I'm just telling you the things that I agree with the governor on. But with that program, with the choice, one question that we have to ask is, how many people will rush to the retirement door to avoid these changes? Because it's a pretty stiff penalty if you're still working. So how many people will actually take the deal? Secondly, how many people who are employed are close enough to retirement and to 65 where they could take Medicare and the health care wouldn't be such a hit to decide, I'm going to stay in the current system? So that is going to impact the numbers as to whether or not this plan works, and we're going to have to, after we've actually seen the bill, see whether or not people take it. That's one reason with the COLA, if we want to encourage people out the door, draw a sharp line between if you're a current employee or you're retired today. So I'll have to see how those numbers work out. The governor's plan also establishes an actuarially sound funding schedule. I think everybody is in favor of that. And then he has one other piece to it, and finally he mentioned that what we should do, because teachers, university employees, and community college employees are in the state pension system but are not state employees, and they are local employees. Why is the state funding their pensions? So he proposed a cost shift, and the speaker has talked about this as well, onto the local employer, be it the university, the community college system, or the local school districts. This would primarily, or it would only impact downstate and suburban teachers, not Chicago teachers, because accurately, it has been stated that Chicago pays their own pension. So the argument has been made that there is some fairness. Now, I think the shift has some policy merit that you cannot deny. Teachers are not state employees. I think that having the employer be responsible for the entire compensation package does put a little skin in the game and put some pressure on their negotiating skills when they're negotiating contracts. And finally, it's been, as has been said, that Chicago does not pay, or does pay their own, the rest of the state doesn't. So why is that? And then why can't I support it if I think there's some merit to it? And I don't support it. I don't support that shift right now. I think, however, though, that school districts need to be aware that the speaker's talking about this, the governor's talking about it, Senator President Cullerton is talking about it. They probably need to be watching this issue very carefully. As Republicans, however, we are unwilling to do this in this bill, an immediate shift, as the speaker mentioned. The governor has talked about a 5-year phase-in. But frankly, the issue is a lot more complex than that, particularly the equity issue of why does Chicago pay and the rest of the state doesn't. What we have to look at is the total funding for education that goes into the city of Chicago versus downstate. Chicago is treated differently in a number of areas, and in fact favorably in a number of areas relative to downstate and suburban schools, and those need to be addressed at the same time there's any discussion of a shift in responsibility for pension costs. So a few of those areas would be the Chicago Block Grant, the General State Aid Formula, the Poverty Grant, the Double Whammy, which is tax cap relief. All of these are very complex programs. There are some programs that apply only to Chicago, and other districts have not been able to get access to them. So Chicago gets more relative to their pupil population than anyone else in the state. They have higher average teacher salaries, higher instructional and operating costs, and of course, lower graduation and test scores. The point is that the pension funding inequity has to be considered in light of all the inequities in the funding. And I'm willing to have that discussion. But I think it's going to have to be a discussion separate and apart from this pension discussion. The savings from the shift are not significant enough to derail it over this issue. It should be set aside, and we need to address the funding inequities across the board. We are anxious to see the actual bills, because the numbers as to whether or not how many people take the deal or not actually solves the pension problem are yet to be seen. And you can't run those numbers until you really do have the details. So I would say our overall tenor on this is we are interested in working with the Democrats on this. I think the governor put forth a good proposal. The cost shift is definitely problematic, but we're looking forward to working on the rest of it with him. Now, moving on to Medicaid, that's another program that's unsustainable. Program liability has grown $5 billion, or 79% between '03 and fiscal year 13. 79%. We've been warning about this for some time now. The enrollment figures have increased 1.4 million people, or 88% since '03. An 88% increase in Medicaid since '03. And interestingly, much of that increase was prior to the '08 economic downturn. It was actually due to aggressive expansions of program eligibility. Well, now we're at a point where we either fix it or it collapses. So add that to the bond rating issue and the election issue, and you've got some pretty strong pressure to deal with Medicaid. So once again, the governor introduced a plan for that last week. His plan included $1.1 billion in programmatic reductions, which includes $225 million by eliminating programs in Medicaid, $900 million in utilization controls, $675 million in provider rate cuts, and if that's distributed across all rate providers, it's between 8 and 9%. It includes a cigarette tax increase, which I'll talk about in a moment, and it includes a $250 million new insurance mandate. It is a good start, but the governor did not meet even by half what he proposed in his budget address, which was going to be $2.7 billion in cuts. He's filled the hole with some revenue components as well. He continues to bank on savings from utilization controls. I have a concern about that because we have passed some utilization controls. In fact, last year, in a bipartisan bill, we passed some good reforms that would have checked eligibility by verifying income, state residency, and doing away with passive redetermination, which essentially means once you're eligible, you're always eligible unless you call the state and say, I'm not eligible. We've had some audit findings on that. Those things haven't been done, so I think we need to see those happen. We're on a little shaky ground counting on $900 million in savings on something that still hasn't been implemented over a year after it was passed. The other thing that concerns the Republicans is the deep rate cuts to providers. The problem is Illinois is already amongst the lowest rate payers in the United States. So it's difficult to ask our providers to continue to provide care and not pay for it. What happens is people walk away from the program. And what we do is end up limiting access. So you keep trying to drive the rates down and people say, I'm just not doing this anymore, and they're out of there. Secondly, we have to be concerned about the courts coming in and saying, you have to pay more. So while rate cut sounds like a great way to fill the hole, it's really a lot more complex than that, and we have to be very careful when we do that, although I think we are willing to engage in discussions with providers of all stripes to figure out how we can adjust rates in ways that are suitable for everyone involved. Probably the biggest reaction that people heard about from Republicans initially was on the cigarette tax. And even as I walked in the room today, people are saying, I'm for the cigarette tax. And I've heard that from a lot of people. And quite frankly, I'm not terribly persuaded that cigarettes are a great thing. I voted for cigarette tax increases before. But the problem is that it is a revenue solution to a spending problem. Okay? We're looking for money rather than looking at the spending side. And it's that default position that's gotten us exactly into the mess that we're in. Now, let me ask you, how is a $300 million cigarette tax increase going to be any more effective in solving this problem once and for all than a $7 billion income tax increase was? It's the same idea. Secondly, if you keep looking for revenue, you have to think, what's next? Now, we can always find some unpopular activity with a small, unsympathetic constituency, and we've seen that. I mean, there's actually a proposal to tax strip clubs. Who cares about that? But then you go the next step, what about fitness clubs? Well, now we're getting into an area that a lot of people say, well, wait a minute. So where does it end? There's never enough revenue, and by always going to the revenue solution, you avoid the structural reform that I said in the beginning is absolutely crucial to solving this problem once and for all. Now, my caucus wants the working group, who has done a phenomenal job, there are legislators from all four caucuses involved in that, to continue to work on program reductions, and we believe there are still some more to be had. We want to maximize those before there's any discussion on the revenue side again. We have to continue to drive structural reform. We need to see the administration implement the utilization controls that have already been passed. Now, we're going to work with the governor in good faith, and the governor does deserve credit here for laying these things out. This is not easy for him and his constituencies. But our focus is going to be on managing and controlling Medicaid and state government in general, and not on finding one revenue source after another, because we'll never solve the problem that way. Now, that's really a fundamental difference in philosophy and approach between the parties. And we've seen it play out. Again, the Democrats passed the income tax increase on their own. They can pass the cigarette tax increase on their own if that's what they want to do. I'm always a little amused when I hear the Senate President and the Speaker talk about how Republicans are blocking, these taxes. Well, we can't, because of the numbers, block anything. The Democrats are in complete control. They have significant majorities in both chambers, and they can pass taxes if they wish to do that. We will, however, work in good faith to steer the policy towards smaller, fiscally responsible, and stable state government. And that ultimately is the best job creator, which brings natural revenue growth into the state, because it creates a safe and inviting environment in which the job creators want to invest. And I can tell you firsthand that's a whole lot easier to do from a position of strength, meaning having more members. So as this discussion continues to unfold on Medicaid, on the pensions, and on the budgets, there's a lot more to come. We only have concepts right now. We need to see the actual bills, and there will be a lot of discussion. At that point, we will have the chance to see whether or not the Democrat epiphany is real or if it's election year rhetoric. And quite frankly, for the sake of all of us, I hope it's the real thing. And I also hope the Cubs win the pennant. So, with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. All of you have got question cards. Let's be sure to get some questions up. Here comes some now. All right.
Ready.
Chris, thank you for those remarks. Here, we got this one early on. Okay. Kent Griffith. Kent, you're in the back. I saw you earlier. There he is, waving in the back. All right, Kent. With Wolf Point Strategies Incorporated, please explain, quote, crony capitalism and, quote, full employment for lawyers as they apply to legislation as played, this says, as played by Cullerton. I'm not sure what that refers to, but there you go.
Well, crony capitalism, I guess I'd explain it as being between a rock and a hard place. I mean, we were in a very difficult situation when we had major employers threatening to leave the state with some valid problems. Certainly their issues would have been much better addressed in a comprehensive review of tax policy and business policy in this state, but we didn't have the luxury of that kind of time. I think that those were people that voted for those did so on a very practical basis, so we did not lose 6,000 employees in the case of Sears and have CME simply move to another state. I still think that that means that we still need to have a more comprehensive review. I wish we would have and put out there a moratorium on those to force a comprehensive review. But as long as people can come in the door and get their special treatment, it avoids dealing with the real issue, which is, again, a complete overhaul of the tax structure in this state.
Okay, City Club member Mark Weiermiller, a small business person, asks your thoughts, Senator Radogno, on elimination of 81 Illinois townships and consolidation of some 880 Illinois school districts to cut the size and the cost of government.
Well, I am for looking at consolidations. I'm for looking at elimination of units of local government. What you always need to be sure, though, when something that sounds really good and you dig into the details to make sure you're accomplishing the policy goals that you want. I think in some cases, some functions of townships probably can be eliminated. I'm not sure that a complete elimination makes sense statewide. So we just need to go carefully. The same thing with school district consolidation. What are the consequences, intended and unintended, that you have when you consolidate districts? And there's many, many factors to consider. You know, varying debt levels, varying salary structures. I know in my local school district, there's federal money that comes in because of Argonne that may be impacted. So it's a complicated issue unless you have a specific proposal in front of you, but in general, it's clearly something we need to do.
Thank you. City Club member Glenn Mazad with RBS Citizens Charter 1 asks, why is there still discussion and delay on terminating the legislative scholarship program? Why won't this be called for a vote in the Illinois Senate?
I think that question is best addressed to Senate President Cullerton. Clearly, that needs to go. I have sponsored the bill. Senator Dillard has sponsored the bill a number of times. There is currently a bill that has already passed the House, has 38 Senate sponsors, so more than enough to pass by a veto-proof majority, and Cullerton has it bottled up in a subcommittee. It is wrong. That program needs to go, and it should have gone a long time ago.
Okay, Senator Radogno, your comment regarding CPS versus downstate education funding. Is it approximately true that the Chicago Public Schools receive 90% of their funding from state and federal funds, whereas downstate and suburban schools receive approximately 90% of their funding from local property taxes?
Yeah, I mean, I addressed this disparity earlier. I don't know that 90% is the figure, but as I mentioned, it is a complicated balance between state and local funding. I do think there's some inequities that go both ways, whether it's the pension funding issue or other funding issues, which is why I believe that that entire issue of the equity between Chicago and the suburban and downstate districts needs to be considered as a whole.
Percy Coleman, soon-to-be City Club member, Percy. Right? Okay. Percy Coleman, Republican committeeman in the 34th Ward, asks, how do the state's major budget cuts affect small business, seniors, youth, and public safety in our state's minority communities?
Well, I think the minority community is as interested in all of these issues as every other community. I mean, obviously, if businesses are not being paid, that's a problem, whether it's in a minority community or not. I think the overarching goal here, though, is the state budget is a problem for small businesses because they don't know that they can count long-term on an environment that's stable and predictable. People don't want to invest in that. I've heard bankers say there's a lot of money sitting on the sidelines. People are worried about investing right now. We need to give people the sense that the other shoe isn't going to drop, that there's not going to be another major tax increase, that we're not going to keep on that revenue solution thing, because another big area where we look for revenue is business. I mean, you know, we don't care about them. They're the bad guys, business. Although their reputation has changed recently. I think people are getting the idea that business is actually our friend. They are not the villains in this state, and we need to treat them well. So I think the budget overall is critical to helping business want to invest here, whether you're in a minority or not community.
Okay, thank you, Percy. Jeff Collard with Haymarket Center points out, we are glad to hear that you are reluctant to look at Medicaid rate cuts. At the Haymarket Center, where some of our Medicaid rates have not been increased since 1994, can human services be held harmless from Medicaid rate cuts?
You know, I don't think anybody can be held harmless from anything in the environment we're in, but I am very sensitive to the fact that there's many different groups of providers, and we probably can't have a one-size-fits-all solution. So there may be some that take a relatively larger hit than others. And certainly, as a social worker, I'm always very partial to the human service providers.
Thank you very much. And let's hear it for Chris Radogno, who is not finished.